Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Forefront Threat Management Gateway Post-Installation Configuration Tasks lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. We'll kick this lesson off with a short discussion about some information you need to understand before we run what's called the Get Starting Wizard in the Threat Management Gateway console. We'll then move on to actually using the Getting Started Wizard, which is actually a series of wizards that will help you get your Threat Management Gateway system up and running and into a usable state. Next, we'll talk about running the Web Access Policy Wizard, which is the next step of the configuration process, and will begin to allow GlobalMantic's users full access to the internet based on rules that you put in place. There are some minimum access needs that have to be put into place in order for any internet connectivity to work, and that will be the next topic of discussion in this lesson. In order to better understand all of this, we'll have a discussion regarding a communications diagram for GlobalMantic. And then we'll do some client testing to see what actually happens when we put some basic rules in place. Next, we'll get a little bit of a more in-depth look at the Threat Management Gateway console itself so that you can gain a better understanding of where to go to do what. And then we'll wrap up this lesson with a short discussion on managing networks and routing with the Threat Management Gateway console. As you might expect, GlobalMantic much prefers a working system over one that simply denies all internet traffic regardless of need. There are three important post-installation wizards that need to be run. GlobalMantic wants you to run those so that you can get your system up and running. The company also wants to make sure that you actually understand the product and how the Threat Management Gateway console works. By the end of this lesson, you'll have a feel for the Threat Management Gateway console, you'll be able to perform the basic configuration tasks, and you'll learn how to manually manage some network options in the console. In the installation video, we did a review of some of the lab setup guidelines that you should understand before moving forward. If you have not yet watched that portion of the installation video, it's early on, you should do so to make sure you understand how the GlobalMantic lab is set up. At a bare minimum, if you're following along at home, you need networks that can act as internal and external networks, unless you're planning to do a single network adapter installation, which we're not going to be doing in this course. GlobalMantic will use an internal and an external network, as well as a DMZ, but if you're following along at home and don't feel like doing a DMZ, at a bare minimum, you need those two networks. Your Threat Management Gateway server needs to have at least two network adapters, one for the internal and one for the external networks. And you can add a third adapter for the DMZ or perimeter network if you like, as GlobalMantic will do. In this lesson, GlobalMantic will define the DMZ network or the perimeter network, but it's not going to do much with it until later on in the course because there's nothing yet in their perimeter network. Now let's talk a little bit about what the Getting Started Wizard actually accomplishes. The first part of the wizard allows you to configure your network settings that you're going to use on your Threat Management Gateway server. The first thing you have to do is choose your operational template, and you'll see what that means in just a minute, although we've discussed it previously in this course. This is where you're going to choose what kind of network architecture you use. Internal, external, edge deployment, front firewall, those kind of options. Next, you'll configure some network settings, and then we'll define a default gateway for the external connection only. You need to leave the gateway blank for all the other connections because this server will act as your router to the internet as well as your router to all of the other connected networks. For the purposes of this course, GlobalMantic will use private IP addresses for everything, including the DMZ and the internal networks. This is not uncommon for organizations to use private IP address spaces for internal networks. The private IP address ranges are as follows: 192.168.0.0 through 192.168.255.255, and you can see that there's also corresponding 172.16 and 10.0 networks that are available for your use. Those IP addresses are not able to be used out on the internet as a public medium, but you can use them behind firewalls and private IP address spaces and then do what's called network address translation to translate those addresses to publicly accessible internet addresses. And Threat Management Gateway would do a lot of that for you. Now, let's go over to the GlobalMantic TMG server and run this portion of the Getting Started Wizard. As you can see, we're on the Threat Management Server system now, as evidenced by what you see up here at the top of the screen. And I'll click the Start button, and I'll choose Forefront Threat Management well, forefront TMG management. This is the first time that I've run the console on this particular system. So the first thing that pops up is the Getting Started wizard. And you'll notice that the first item here is Configure Network Settings. So I'm going to go ahead and do that by just clicking Configure Network Settings. And this is going to start the Network Setup wizard. And I'll click Next on the first page here because there's nothing of interest. And as I mentioned, the first step we have to undertake is to choose our network template. Well, we're going to choose a 3-leg perimeter for Global Mantics. And this is where we're going to have an internal network, a perimeter network, and an external network defined. And I'll click Next to move on. Now it wants to know what network adapter is connected to the LAN, or the internal network. Well, I've named my network adapter, so this is very easy. Internal. You'll notice that I have no default gateway defined for this network. I don't need one, and I shouldn't define one at this point. If I had other networks that were outside this, that were connected to this particular internal network, I could add routes to those networks here. I don't have those for Global Mantics, so I'm simply going to click Next to move on. Now, it wants to know what network adapter is connected to the internet. Well, that's our external network adapter. And I'm using, again, a static IP address along with no DNS server. The DNS server is defined on the internal network adapter. And I'll click Next. And finally, which network adapter is connected to the perimeter network? The DMZ. And you'll see that I've chosen the 172.16 address space for the DMZ. And it's going to ask me what kinds of IP addresses do servers in the perimeter network use? Do they use public addresses or private addresses? Well, for Global Mantics, they use private addresses, which means there's a route relationship between the perimeter network and the internal network potentially, and a NAT relationship between the perimeter network and the external network. That's the really key part here. Any machines that are accessed from outside the network will have to go through a network address translation process in order to be able to be accessed. And that's something we'll be doing later on in this course. So I'll click Next. And then I'll click Finish. That completes the network setup wizard. And then Threat Management Gateway does its magic behind the scenes to apply the configuration items that we just configured. And you can see that a green check mark means that it was able to make all of the configuration changes that you specified with no errors. If you had something like a disabled network adapter by mistake or something along those lines, that process would not have been able to complete very easily. So that's the green check mark is a good sign that everything should be in working order as long as you specified good information. If you specified bad information, obviously, it's not going to work so well. Next up is an easy one. There's just a couple of things we've got to choose from on the next stage of the Configure System Settings area, which is to manage some host settings, including if we're going to have a domain or workgroup configuration, which one do we want? And we've talked previously in this course about the fact that Global Mantics is going to choose to run in a domain configuration, which means the Threat Management Gateway server is joined to the globalmantics.com domain. We then have to specify the DNS suffix we're going to use. But the defaults are pretty much acceptable for Global Mantics. So we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system now, and we're going to run this portion of the Getting Started wizard. So here we are. I'll simply click Configure System Settings, which starts yet another wizard. I'll click the next button on this non-pertinent page. In this case, it's a member of the Windows domain globalmantics.com. And because we're a member of the domain, then the primary DNS suffix is provided by the domain controller. So there's not a whole lot to do here, except basically click Next. And then click Finish. That portion of the wizard really couldn't be much easier if you're running in a domain environment. In the final stage of the Getting Started wizard, asks us to define some deployment options. How do we want to update Threat Management Gateway? Do you want to use Microsoft Update, which is automatic, or would you prefer to update Threat Management Gateway manually on your own? Obviously, there's two schools of thought here. The folks who want to keep this as hands-off as possible are going to say, just do update for me automatically. I don't want to really have to be all that involved. And you can also change the level of engagement there as well, but for the most part, the Microsoft Update piece will be automatic, although you can configure it to just simply download the updates for you and not necessarily apply them immediately all the time. A lot of people like to do these kinds of updates to key infrastructure systems manually, because Microsoft is not always perfect when it comes to their updates. It would not be necessarily a good thing to introduce instability into the environment by accidentally applying a bad update which took down your edge firewall or made the network insecure because of an issue in one of the updates. Global Mantex, because they are short-staffed, is going to use the Microsoft Update automatic option. And they understand the potential risks, but also the rewards that come with that. We then have to choose which features we want to enable. The network inspection system and web protection, which will require a separate license, but we will use the trial license that Microsoft provides for Global Mantex for the purposes of this course. Now, let's move over to the Threat Management Gateway system and run this third and final piece of the Getting Started wizard. So the only box without a check mark is Define Deployment Options, so we'll click that option, and again we'll skip the welcome screen. And we'll use Microsoft Update Service to check for updates. Click Next. For Network Inspection System, we have some options, which is to disable or activate the complementary license and enable NIS, so we're going to do that. And for Web Protection, we have an option of activating an evaluation license, activating a purchase license, or disabling web protection. We're going to activate the evaluation license for this course, although Global Mantex will deploy with an actual purchased license. We also have to choose which features we want, malware inspection only or also URL filtering. Global Mantex plans to deploy with both malware inspection enabled and URL filtering enabled, so we're going to make sure there's a check mark next to each one. Make sure you understand this caveat. The URL filtering feature requeries the Microsoft Reputation Service. This is an online service that Microsoft keeps up to date. So, full URLs can and will be sent to Microsoft to make sure that the appropriate categories are always as current as possible. This is a secure connection, but for those that are particularly sensitive, it may mean that you are sending information to Microsoft that you might not want to send. So you have to make sure that you're balancing that in your plans as you deploy Threat Management Gateway. You'll notice this evaluation license will expire on September 8th, 2011. And I'll click Next. The network inspection system works on a signature basis, and what this basically does is help protect you against potential zero-day exploits in software and other non-zero-day exploits, anything that's a known vulnerability. So, how do you want to handle definition updates? Do you want to check for and install definitions? Just check for definitions, or do you want to not have anything happen in an automatic way? Well, the network inspection system is really a, no pun intended, signature piece of Threat Management Gateway. So we want to make sure that this is kept as current as humanly possible. So I'm going to choose the recommended action, which is to check for and install updates every 15 minutes is the default. So we'll keep that in place for this particular deployment. After 45 days by default, if there's been no updates, you'll get an alert somewhere in the console. And that's something we want to have, we'll leave in place again by default for this particular deployment. And then you have a number of decisions, well, a number of options from which to choose as far as signature set configuration goes. You can use the default policy, detect only response, or no response. We're going to keep the default, which is the default and recommended action. And then we'll click Next. Another option you have is to whether or not you wanted to participate in the Customer Experience Improvement Program, which is a way that Microsoft gathers information and then anonymizes it as much as possible about your hardware configuration and basically how you use the product. And this helps Microsoft make decisions about what they're going to include and do in the next version of the product. Global Mantex likes to participate in this sort of community, so they're going to choose to participate in the Customer Experience Improvement Program. Next up, we have what's called the Microsoft Telemetry Reporting Service. As your organization or as Global Mantex is attacked or as users browse certain websites that may attempt to introduce malware into the environment, the fact that this malware was encountered can be sent off to Microsoft so that they can help them improve the product's ability to identify attack patterns and mitigate against them. Now, that's a key thing here. The Microsoft Telemetry Reporting Service is a big part of how the malware protection works in Threat Management Gateway, and if you have a number of options to choose from with your level of participation. The last option is none, and that basically means that you won't send anything to Microsoft about attack patterns, and you're not really helping on a community basis to help the full group of folks who use this service improve their posture against potential attacks. If you do want to participate, there's two levels. There's basic and advanced. Basic information, so there's basic and advanced. Basic information will include basically type and origin of potential attacks, and then a response that is taken, and then it's going to get sent off to Microsoft. On the advanced side, you're going to send a little bit more. You're going to send the same information you'd send under a basic membership, but you're also going to send more details, such as traffic samples themselves and full URL strings, which means that you may be sending some potentially sensitive information to Microsoft. Again, you've got to balance the risk and reward here. Because of the company's desire to want to make use of the full feature set of Threat Management Gateway, GlobalMantics feels like they should participate to the highest level possible in this service. So we're going to choose the advanced option and tap Next. And then from here, we'll look at the summary screen, which is just a rehash of what we've selected, and click the Finish button. One of the biggest problems I have is being patient sometimes, and I waited long enough and the Getting Started Wizard third stage completed, and you can see that there's now a check mark next to Define Deployment Options. So it was a successful process. I'm not going to repeat this exact same information that we just went through in the demonstration, but I wanted to make sure that I listed all of this information for you in the slides so that if you wanted to take a look at it a little bit more in leisure that you could. Now, as it stands right now, Threat Management Gateway is still in lockdown mode with a deny all rule in place to block any and all traffic. You have to explicitly allow the kind of traffic that you want to be able to traverse the firewall in either direction, in any direction. It's from internal to external, from external to internal, and what have you. The initial web access rules that you put into place are going to be created with the Web Access Policy Wizard. For example, do you want to block minimum recommended URL categories? You have to choose which blocked categories, such as gambling, adult-oriented sites, and things like that you want to be able to block with Threat Management Gateway. Next, you have to decide if there are some users that should have unrestricted access to the internet. Do you want someone, for example, a compliance officer, to be able to have unrestricted access so that they can see what people are trying to do? Do you want to enable malware inspection, HTTPS inspection, web caching? Those are the kind of questions that will be answered through the use of the Web Access Policy Wizard, which we're going to do right now. And here's the Getting Started Wizard on the screen. And at the very bottom, you'll notice that there's a little checkbox next to Run the Web Access Wizard. So I'm just going to simply click the Close button, and then that wizard will start. And it's like magic. That wizard started. So here's the summary page of what's going to happen here. So we'll simply click Next. And do we want to create a rule that blocks minimum recommended URL categories? Yeah, let's do that. So we'll click Next. And here's a list of the web destinations that are going to be blocked. Anonymizers. These are the kind of sites where people can go to try to get around your policies. Botnets, anything that's associated with criminal activities, gambling, hate discrimination, obscene, tasteless, spyware, adware, violence. Basically, the kind of stuff you really don't want people wasting their time on during the workday. If you want to add additional categories, you can click the Add button, and you can add particular destinations from the list of networks that you see here or the list of URL categories if you like. Do you want to block access to dating sites? Do you want to block access to so-called dubious sites or educational sites? You can block on a whole host of categories. For GlobalMantics, the list of default web destinations is sufficient, so we'll simply click Next. At this point, GlobalMantics has no users that are going to be completely allowed to go through the firewall, so we're not going to add anything to this space. But if we wanted to, we'd simply click the Add button and then choose what users should have access through the firewall. And if you wanted to create new users, add a new user group, or edit one, you could do that as well. We do want to enable malware inspection. So we want to inspect web content that's requested from the internet. And if somebody tries to download an encrypted archive, we can choose to block those if we want to. Now, encrypted archives serve a dual purpose. Sometimes they're used to protect personally identifiable information. I know where I work, we actually use encrypted zip files to transmit student information when we need to. So by blocking encrypted archives, you could be doing yourself a disservice as well. Remember, security is a balance between security and usability. If you secure too much, you lose the ability for your users to be able to do their jobs, and they will actively try to find ways around your security systems. Now, that's not because they're trying to be malicious or do anything wrong. It's because they're trying to get their jobs done. And there's a big difference between getting their jobs done and doing something malicious. So we're going to uncheck blocking encrypted archives, even though that does open us up for a little bit more risk. Do we want to allow users to establish HTTPS connections to websites? Well, yeah. I mean, we really want people using HTTPS as much as possible because it protects the company and the individual more. However, for now, we're not going to inspect HTTPS traffic, but we'll take a look at this later on in this course. So we'll click Next. And do we want to cache the web information? Basically, do we want to set up web content in a cache mode so that when multiple users request the same content, it only has to be downloaded from the internet one time? So we'll click the Cache Drives button, and we'll set a minimum cache size of, say, 500 megs to start. And then we'll click Apply, OK, and we'll click Next to continue. And when we're done, click the Finish button, and we've completed the wizard. And we now get to see the console in all its glory, but we're going to first go back to the presentation and continue on. Now, we've set up a basic web access policy for our users, but we have to do a little bit more. We need to make sure that HTTPS and DNS services are able to work through the firewall. The reason is because the internal DNS server for GlobalMantics, which is running on the domain controller, forwards external requests to Google's public DNS servers for handling. This is how users are able to browse the internet. Without the ability for the internal DNS server to forward requests to an external DNS server, then web browsing would not work. So we're going to add rules. We're going to manually update the previously created rule to enable GlobalMantics internal DNS servers to communicate with outside DNS servers. We're basically going to allow the internal network to make any DNS request to the external network that it needs to make. So we'll go over to the Threat Management Gateway server now and do that, and then we're going to move on with a little deeper look at the console and some other things. Here we are at the console. I'm going to expand the console. I'm going to go to Web Access Policy. And I want to show you what we have to begin with. We have a deny rule, which basically blocks a whole lot of stuff. The first rule denies any information from all users or any requests from all users from the internal network to any website that's in these categories. And then from there, we have an allow rule that allows web access from all users from the internal network to the external network. Let's take a look at the firewall policy, because the firewall is a pretty important piece of equipment. This gives you a little bit more information because it shows that we're allowing web access, but only HTTP and HTTPS from the internal network to the external network. So I'm going to right-click this policy, and I'm going to choose Properties. On the Protocols tab, I'm going to add DNS. And then click Apply and click OK. Now that will allow internal communication between our internal systems and the external network to work just a little bit better, because DNS will actually operate the way we expect. In order to apply this change, however, we have to click the Apply button up here, which will rebuild the configuration for Threat Management Gateway. So we're going to save the changes and restart these services. Now, this will take the firewall down for a very short period of time, but we need to do that in order for this change to take place. So we'll click OK. We can type the description for the change. We'll just type DNS and click Apply. And OK. And that's all there is to that. Before we keep going, I just wanted to give you an idea of how DNS is going to operate in the GlobalMantics environment and why it was important that we open up that DNS rule. First of all, you'll notice we have step 1, which is traffic from the GlobalMantics PC1 to the domain controller. This is that initial DNS query once a user opens up Internet Explorer. Because the DNS entry is not local, the domain controller has to send it off somewhere else for other handling, the DNS server on the domain controller. So in step 2, that request is forwarded to Google's DNS servers through the firewall. The return comes back to the DC1 system, which sends it off to the gmpc1, which will cache that for future use so that it can then go directly through the firewall in steps 5 and 6 to its target website. Now let's do some testing to see what happens. First of all, from the internal PC, the Windows 7 PC that GlobalMantics has sitting on the internal network right now, we're going to attempt to browse to www.trainsignal.com. We're going to find that this request will work just fine. Remember, DNS requests are now allowed through the firewall to upstream DNS servers for handling, so we won't have any problems with that. And TrainSignal is not on the restricted sites list. Next, we're going to attempt to browse to www.gambling.com. This is one that will be blocked because of the fact that it's a URL that exists in the gambling URL category. And actually, from the Threat Management Gateway server, you can test individual URLs to see what category they're in. So we're going to go over to the Windows 7 desktop and run these tests. Now let's see if these rules actually work by doing some testing. GlobalMantics just happens to have a Windows 7 desktop for just this very purpose, sitting on their internal network. The first thing we're going to do is attempt to browse to www.trainsignal.com. And this request you're going to find will work just fine because it's not a restricted site and there's nothing nefarious about TrainSignal. And we've allowed DNS requests through the firewall to enable access to external DNS servers, basically upstream DNS servers, that we can get appropriate DNS activity happening. Next, we're going to attempt to browse to www.gambling.com from the very same PC, and you're going to find that the request will be blocked due to the fact that it's on a URL in a restricted categories list. And from the Threat Management Gateway server itself, you can actually test individual URLs to see which category they might be in. So without further ado, let's go over to our Threat Management Gateway server and our Windows 7 desktop and make these things happen. Here we are on the Windows 7 desktop machine, and I'll simply start in Internet Explorer, and right away we'll get a good sign. The fact that the MSN homepage comes up means that web access is working, and that's a good thing. And I'll go to www.trainsignal.com just to prove to you that it actually is not a nefarious site. And it comes up with no problems. Now I'll go to www.gambling.com, and we're going to get a very different result. We're going to see that the access was denied, and the reason is URL. And you get a whole bunch of other pertinent information for support reasons here. Basically, this is the kind of stuff that your users need to read to you if they call you complaining about a site being blocked. Now let's go over to the Threat Management Gateway system and take a look at some things you can see here to look up URLs. And I also want to show you why the rules fell the way they did. Okay, the first thing I want to do is look up that URL. So I'm on the Web Access Policy area of the Threat Management Gateway console. And over here you're going to see in the Tasks pane, I can query for URL category. So I'll do that, and I'll type www.gambling.com. And click Query, and we'll get a note saying that this is in the gambling category. And this has been categorized by Microsoft Reputation Service. So when someone calls you up complaining about the fact that a particular site is blocked, this is one way you can check to see why it may have been blocked. But now, why did the rules fall out the way they did? Well, all of the rules you see on your screen here are processed in order, starting with the first rule and going to the last rule. So the first rule is a deny rule. Now, when we browsed a TrainSignal, we did not meet the requirements of this rule. In other words, we were browsing from the internal network, but we were not hitting any of the things in any of these categories. The TrainSignal site does not exist in any of these restricted categories. Therefore, we failed this rule, so Threat Management Gateway moved us on to the next rule. Now, we failed a deny rule. That's a good thing if we're trying. Now, we failed a deny rule. That's a good thing if we're trying to get access to something. And then we hit this rule, which is an allow rule that basically allows all other web access from the internal network to the external network. And that's why we were able to browse to the TrainSignal site, because this allow rule hit and allowed us to do that browsing. When we went to www gambling.com, we satisfied the conditions of this initial deny rule. So immediately we were denied access based on the fact that this deny rule was in place. I'm going to go to firewall policy, and this looks very similar. It shows you the same rules, but notice the last rule that we have set up in our firewall is a default deny all rule. Denies all traffic from all networks to all networks. This is one you want to leave in place, and we'll talk about this more later on in this course. But the last rule should be something basically saying, hey, there's a condition I haven't thought about, so deny it until I know about it. Now you've gotten to see the Threat Management Gateway console a little bit already, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it here because you're going to get very familiar with the Threat Management Gateway console throughout this course. But let's take a look at the major gateway console throughout this course. But let's take a look at the major areas that comprise the console. The very top of the page, you have what you've become used to in most Windows programs, or most programs on any platform, which is menus and toolbars. At the left-hand side of the screen, we have all the nodes you can visit. And we've already looked at the firewall policy and web access nodes, and we'll be taking a look at the networking node here in just a few minutes. The notification area is a place where you're going to get notifications. And where we've seen this already is when we've been told that we have to make changes to our configuration. Do we want to apply or discard them? This is a very front and center place where Threat Management Gateway tells us some things that we need to know right away. The very center of the screen, which is where all the action generally happens, is the work area, and that's where we've modified some rules and where you're going to look at a lot of things as we move forward in the course. And then at the right-hand side of the screen, we have Toolbox, Tasks, and Help, and this is basically quick access to certain things. We went to the Tasks area once we had the Web Access Policy node selected, and on the Tasks area there, we got to see that there was a test URL categorization item from which we could test particular URLs to see where they're categorized. So this gives you quick access to certain specific actions based on the context of the rest of the console. The last item for discussion in this lesson is a quick discussion about networks and routing. Threat Management Gateway creates network objects in the console for each network is connected to your server. And we kind of saw this a little bit when we did the wizards earlier on. When you select the network node in the Threat Management Gateway console, you're going to see a number of tabs in the work area of the screen from which you can choose. I'm going to run through what those tabs are, and then we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway system so you can take a look at them in the production environment. You have networks, and this is the location where you can define networks and relationships between different networks. We then have network sets. And this allows you to basically group individual networks so they can be treated as a single object for firewall rules. There are some predefined network sets, all networks, and all protected networks. So if you want to assign a rule to all networks, you can use that all networks network set rather than having to use internal, external, or DMZ. With network rules, you can create connectivity between disparate networks. A network can be connected with NAT relationships or route relationships. Traffic flows can be created between networks by virtue of firewall access rules. And we'll say what this all means in just a second. You can also manage network adapters from the Networks node in Threat Management Gateway. The Network Adapters tab displays connection details for network adapters that are installed in your Threat Management Gateway server. And this is where you can modify all of your network adapter settings, which we'll see in just a minute. Firewall is basically a router on steroids. This provides you with an at-a-glance look at all routes that are defined on your Threat Management Gateway server. If you have multiple Threat Management Gateway servers in your environment, you can enable what's called web chaining, which will enable requests from clients to be directed to upstream Threat Management Gateway servers for handling. The final tab you'll see is ISP redundancy, and if you have more than one internet service provider, this is the page on which you're going to make the configuration options that are necessary for that redundancy to work. Now, let's go over to the Threat Management Gateway server and take a look at what this means right now for Global Mantics. This will not be a comprehensive necessarily look because we'll be looking at all of this in the rest of this course, but this is a basic concept to which you need to be made aware of so that you can adequately manage the Threat Management Gateway server in your own environment. We're back at the console. I'm going to go to the networking node over here, and you're going to see a list of all the stuff that I just talked about, all these tabs across the top of the page. On the Networks tab is a list of all of the networks that exist on the Threat Management Gateway system. Notice our internal network is the 10.1 address space. The DMZ, or the perimeter network, is the 172 space that we defined earlier. And the external network is basically everything else. On network sets, we have all networks and we have all protected networks. And you can add new network sets if you like, so that if you have lots and lots of networks you need to manage, you can manage them as a group. Next, we have network rules. And this is where you can see the network rules that are in place. In fact, it's a little hard to see because this screen is not very wide. But this is where you can see the rules that are in place. For example, local host access, source networks, destination networks, perimeter to external relationships, how they're happening. Remember, we said before that we were going to use NAT in order to be able to have access to machines in our perimeter network. Well, we see that defined here. Again, we're going to make lots of changes to this throughout the course, but I wanted to introduce you to this area before we continue. Next, we have our network adapters. This is pretty easy. They're all connected. Here's the subnet mask. Here's the IP address space. Here's the address type. And here's the name of the network adapter. You can right-click one and choose Properties to make configuration changes if you like. We have a lot of routes. Threat Management Gateway is going to create routes for you based on the kind of destinations that it needs to be able to keep track of. The 0.0.0.0 route is basically your default route. In fact, if you've done any network configuration at all, you may be very familiar with creating a default route for 0.0.0.0. We then have the 10.1.1.0 network, which is identified by the fact that it's a 255.255.255.0 net mask. That means it's a network net mask of 24 bits. And its gateway is going to be the internal network adapter. So when we try to send traffic out to anything on 10.1.1.0, it's going to use the internal network adapter as its routing point. And then you're going to see some host-based routes, 10.1.1.1, 10.1.1.255, and a number of other ones. We have a loopback adapter, which is the internal network adapter in the Threat Management Gateway server. This is basically a pseudo network adapter, which 127.0.0.1 always points back to a local host, and so on and so forth. We're not going to do much with web chaining and ISP redundancy in this course, but I wanted to make you familiar with where they are so that you can use them if you need to in your own environment. We started this lesson with a discussion about some information you need to understand before running the Getting Started wizard, and then we actually ran the Getting Started wizard to perform the initial configuration of the GlobalMantic's Threat Management Gateway system. Next, we ran the Web Access Policy wizard in order to enable basic access to the internet, and then we enabled some additional minimum access needs, specifically DNS traffic. You then got to look at some GlobalMantic's communications information. For why DNS traffic is important. And then we did some testing just to prove the Threat Management Gateway was working its magic. From there, you got to look at the Threat Management Gateway console, and we wrapped up with a short discussion on managing networks and routing in Threat Management Gateway, a topic we'll be revisiting throughout this course. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.